Hi, this is Jeff Hastings. Today we're going to go over Chapter 7, which is memory. Before we get started, just a little food for thought. What are some of your earliest memories? How vivid and detailed are those memories? Why do you think you're able to remember like the words from a song that you've not heard maybe in years, but have a harder time remembering such thing as like your grocery list or even material for this exam? Do you think you can train yourself to have a better memory? Why or why not? These are some of the things that we're going to talk about today. And the good news is you can have a better memory. And the first step is to understand how you memorize or how you learn information, how your brain interprets that information that we discussed about during the last class. And now you're going to think about how you're actually able to recall that learned experience from memory or from your brain. So, of course, after you read this chapter, I can't emphasize enough that you need to read the chapters in the guide, in the ebook or your textbook. It's very important that you do that before you take your weekly quizzes. A lot of the information, because it's so much information, we'll cover on average 3 different chapters per week. And because we have to go through it so quickly, I want to make certain that you do read the material and also take some notes on the important topics. You may have noticed also we do have now an audio definitions for every single chapter you're going to find in D2L. So I highly encourage you to download the definition audio for each chapter and listen to that whenever you're driving or, between classes or whatever, because it will help you understand all of the questions that we're going to kind of go over during the week and on the weekly quiz. So as you can see on your screen, we have a lot of information to cover today in Chapter 7. It's a very interesting chapter, but it is very involved. So let's go ahead and begin. Let's start with this video.
Welcome, students, to the captivating video summary of Chapter 7 from your textbook, Introduction to Psychology, Gateways to Mind and Behavior, authored by Dennis Kuhn, John Mitterer, and Tanya Martini. Today, we embark on an illuminating journey into the intricate landscape of memory. In this chapter, we will unravel depths of sensory, short-term and long-term memory, deciphering its complexities and uncovering the fascinating processes that underpin our ability to retain, recall, and utilize information. Through this exploration, we will gain a deeper understanding of how memory influences our cognition, behavior, and overall experience of the world around us. If you've already forgotten what I've said, don't worry. We will also provide tips on how you can improve your memory and in the process improve your life. Let's dive in. Have you ever marveled at how your brain effortlessly recalls the aroma of your favorite dish or the lyrics of a song from your childhood? This intricate and enthralling system within our brain serves as the silent storekeeper of our past. It wields remarkable power, enabling us to summon memories from mere moments ago or harken back to events from years gone by. However, despite its awe-inspiring capabilities, memory is not without its vulnerabilities. At times, it can lead us astray, revealing its fallibility and imperfections. Indeed, memory, with its blend of resilience and fragility, holds a profound influence over our lives. It serves as a potent instrument that sketches the tapestry of our past, shaping our perceptions and responses. Research in the field of psychology has shown that memory's imperfections are well documented, and its malleability can sometimes lead to inaccuracies in recollection. For instance, eyewitness testimonies often demonstrate the fallibility of human memory, shedding light on its susceptibility to distortion and alteration. Understanding the intricacies of memory empowers us to take proactive steps in preserving and enhancing this remarkable cognitive faculty. Engaging in regular mental exercises, maintaining a healthy lifestyle, and practicing mnemonic techniques are just a few strategies that can bolster our memory and stave off age-related decline. For instance, try to remember 6 of the letters you see in front of you: H, O, N, S, D, and C. Now try to remember the 6 from the row below: O, K, H, D, N, and R. We will come back to those letters in a moment. You see, our memory isn't just a singular function. It's a complex system divided into sensory, short-term and long-term memory. The sensory memory acts as a buffer for stimuli received through the five senses. It holds this information in its raw form for a very brief period of time, typically under a second. Then we have short-term memory, also known as working memory. It's like a mental workspace where information is held temporarily for processing. It's crucial for tasks such as learning, reasoning, and comprehension. Finally, long-term memory is the vast storehouse of knowledge and experiences. This is where everything from your first birthday to the capital of France is stored. It's like a library of life experiences and learned facts. Each type of memory has its unique function, working together to help us navigate our world. They interact and intersect, painting a multidimensional picture of our past, shaping our present and guiding our future. Now let's focus on working memory, also known as short-term memory. This is a system for temporarily storing and managing the information required to carry out complex cognitive tasks such as learning, reasoning, and comprehension. It's like the mental workspace where we manipulate information. The capacity of working memory is limited. It's often said that we can hold about 7 chunks of information in our working memory at any one time. But don't be disheartened. This capacity isn't fixed. Just as a muscle gets stronger with exercise, your working memory can also be improved with practice. For example, a technique of relating mnemonic phrases or poems can be used to encode alpha and numeric sequences. Can you remember the first set of 6 letters you attempted to memorize earlier? If not, don't worry. Unless the letters were meaningful, most people can only recall 2 or 3. However, if you would have remembered the phrase, "Henry only needs 7 dogs and cats," you may have remembered the letters were H, O, N, S, D, and C. Remember, your brain is a marvel of nature, and its potential is immense. With practice and the right techniques, you can certainly enhance your working memory. Intrigued by how your mind functions? Get ready for our exploration of cognition, language, and creativity. We'll unlock the secrets of how we think, communicate, and create. Thank you for listening. This has been another video by Jeffrey Hastings, Professor of Psychology. Until next time, remember, I think, therefore I am, probably thinking about pizza. I'm starving.
Okay, Unit 1, a general mode of memory. We'll get into that. You can follow along, of course, in your book as we go through these things, these slides. And also, I highly encourage you to have OneNote open and take notes as we move along. So memory is a series of active systems that receive, store, organize, alter, and recover information. Memory is best defined as the active process that one receives information from one's senses, stores that information, organizes the stored information, and then retrieves the information from storage. That's something you may want to know for your test. But the different types of memory we're going to talk about. First off, we're going to talk about sensory memory. It's a mental representation of how environmental events look, sound, feel, smell, and taste. It includes a long-term component useful for such activities as recognizing a color or a familiar voice. However, most vivid details of sensory memory seem to fade quickly. Short-term memory refers to the brain systems involved in storing information for a short period of time, usually up to around 30 seconds maximum, with only around 7 pieces of information at a time. Many events and memories compete for the attention in the brain, and the brain does not store all of them. However, long-term memory refers to a brain's systems involved in storing events, of course, for a long period of time. That long-term memory refers to the memory process in the brain that takes information from the short-term memory first and then creates long-lasting memories. These memories can be made, from an hour ago or several decades ago. Long-term memory can hold an unlimited amount of information for an indefinite period of time. So on this slide, you can see the illustration of the Atkinson-Shiffrin model of memory, or it's actually a process map of it. In its simplest form, the Atkinson-Shiffrin model holds that if you attend to information registered in a sensory store, that is like the auditory information associated with just a couple of spoken words, some of that information will be transferred to the short-term store or storage in your memory, where it can be rehearsed and ultimately transferred to the long-term store. So think about your brain in that way, where it has long-term and short-term storage. In essence, short-term storage is what you're consciously thinking about right now, and nothing is transferred to long-term storage without first passing through your short-term storage. Later, any information successfully transferred to long-term storage can be retrieved back into short-term storage, like back into your conscious awareness. The model shows 3 different memories. So you're going to see there sensory memory, short-term working memory. It's also short-term is also referred to as working memory, and long-term memory. So on the left, you see sensory input. It's shown as the input to sensory memory. That's sensory input to sensory memory. The output from sensory memory is selective attention, which is also the input to short-term working memory. The output from short-term memory is encoding and storage, which is also shown as the input to long-term memory. So the map also shows retrieval from long-term memory, which goes as the input to short-term memory. And if you look at that curve that goes backward, it's labeled maintenance rehearsal. That's shown within short-term working memory in the direction from long-term memory back to sensory memory. So when you're looking at this illustration and just thinking about the Atkinson-Shiffrin model of memory, or you're asked a question about it on the test, it's important to remember the following. Successful long-term remembering involves 3 memory systems. That is 3 types of memory. That's the sensory, short-term, and long-term. Sensory memory stores sensory information for only a second or 2. It's actually the fastest to dissolve. Selectively attending to the information allows it to move into short-term working memory where it is processed. So you have to selectively, you've got to voluntarily attend to or think about the input that you're receiving, those senses. Any resulting meaningful information may be encoded, and we'll talk about encoded here in a moment, in long-term memory, where it's stored until it's needed, at which time it may be retrieved. So, this is a very useful slide, but it makes it very simplified. It does not explain all the inner workings of our brain, but you kind of get the idea. So just a quick knowledge check activity. What process is used to move memory into permanent storage in long-term memory? And that's what encoding is. That we'll talk about that here in a moment, but it's how you encode data, that input, is how you move the memory into that permanent storage. Is you have to encode it. It's not just pay attention to it, you have to encode it. And we'll talk about that here in a moment. So in Unit 2, we're of course in that chapter, point 2, is sensory and short-term working memory. We saw in section 4.1 that we can gather information from the world through a variety of senses. If you remember all of the senses, a touch, smell, all those different type of senses. This information enters into what we refer to as sensory memory. And that is the capacity of that sensory memory is thought to be very, very large, but its duration, though, is very short. It's the information enters sensory memory. It cannot be held for very long at all. You just need to know that. Sensory memory is very short. It's important to note that we're typically not aware of sensory memory as well. So to get an idea of what sensory memory is like, kind of look at the title where it says sensory memory on the screen. Just look at it for a few minutes or a few seconds, and now close your eyes. If you're lucky, you kind of see this photocopy of the letters that are in your memory. That's actually called iconic memory. And that is memory, it's stored visual sensory images, and it actually is only stored for it's less than a second, a half of a second. And that is called iconic memory. Similarly, we're going to look at when you hear information, the senses also with hearing and that sound. Sensory memory stores up those sounds for about 2 seconds as an echoic. So think of echoic memory, and it's a brief flurry of activity in the auditory system. That's called an echoic memory. Very easy. Think of an echo. If you're selectively attending to sensory input, such as the words on the slide, for instance, then it can move into temporary storage. And think of it this way. You are selectively, voluntarily, consciously trying to memorize or think about and process the information that I'm telling you right now and that you're reading on the screen. And you're trying to process it into a temporary storage part of your brain called short-term memory. If there are any background events that receive, very little attention, like if you have your television playing or you have music in the background, that is likely not going to convert to short-term memory. As a matter of fact, you may not even hear it anymore. You kind of weed it out. It's there, but you're not focusing attention on that music or that TV. And also similar, if you're just looking at the words on the slide, but you're not paying attention, maybe because you're watching the television, it's unlikely that the information that I'm talking about right now is going to go past your sensory memory. So you have to the first step in memorizing or understanding information is to have focused attention, is to actively and, engage conscious engagement into learning, into trying to memorize and process that information, to basically just think. So when we talk about short-term memory, also called, and I mentioned that, working memory, it's thought to be a storage that has very small capacity. It only holds a small amount of information. It's relatively short duration, about maybe 6 seconds or so. And when we talk about the Atkins-Shiffrin model, since that was proposed, psychologists realized that short-term memory is not just a temporary storage space. Instead, it's better conceived of as a kind of mental workbench where information we're currently thinking about is subject to a lot of mental activity. I mean, we're processing tons of information whenever we're listening and watching, the video and reading. For example, information in short-term memory can be evaluated and compared with other things we know too when we're processing it. So I want you to think about you're at the mall and you're looking at different shirts and you're processing information. Wow, this shirt may look good on me. And then you start thinking about, well, is this nicer than the one I tried on in the store before? So we can mentally image how that information is being processed, that decision in our brain, if we're going to buy it, is it going to look better with a different color? And we can perform the operation of purchase and also thinking about calculations too, and thinking, wow, the second shirt, I may not like as much, but it was 50% off. And that's going to make a big difference. So this is how you're processing all of this data. So as a result of all the activity that happens here in this short-term memory, that's why they kind of renamed it and rethought about it and said it should be called working memory, because it emphasizes all the work that goes on to the thought process. And working memory also is the only type of memory that's conscious. It's another important thing to remember. It's the only type of memory that's conscious. Whenever you read a book, do mental math, put together a puzzle, plan a meal, follow directions, study for a test, you're using your working memory. And Stephen Kosslyn, Thomas Ball, Brian Reeser, you don't need to know the names, but they provided a demonstration that was really good of the fact that mental operations are being carried out in working memory. And this happened many years ago, over 30 years ago, actually over 40, in 1978. And what they did was participants first memorized like a map that's shown. You'll see it here in 7.2a, and that's also in the book that I copied that from. They were then asked to picture a black dot moving from one object, such as one of the trees, to another, such as the hut at the top of the island. Did people really form a working memory image to do this task? And actually they asked that question and said, actually, it looks like they did. As you see in 7.2b, the time that it took to move the dot was directly related to the actual distances on the map. That's just how your brain is processing or scanning these mental images. So this is, it's called a treasure map. You don't really need to know everything about this, but it's just an important way to understand the process of how this works. The capacity of working memory. Think about how much information can be held in our working memory. It depends on whether the information is comprised of sounds, mental images, or a combination of the two. If I were to ask you to memorize, let's say, like you did in the video earlier with the different letters or different numbers, and there's been a lot of research done on how many numbers does the average person realize. They actually have done a lot of research on it, and they call it a digit span test, and it's a measure of attention and working memory that most people have. And they found that most adults correctly repeat about 7 digits. And that's why you see phone numbers and other type of things in 7. It's for several reasons, and one of those is because that's what the working memory is of most people. But the series was likely to go beyond the capacity of your working memory. They had another report done. Psychologist George Miller found that working memory is limited to the magic number of 7 or -2, so 5 to 9 information bits. That part is in the book if you would like to read a little bit more about working memory to see how much most people can memorize. But that also is another thing that when we get into intelligence testing in the next few chapters, you're going to see that that is one way that a lot of these psychological tests test someone's intelligence, basically trying to test how many numbers can people memorize or recall after they've heard information. How long, do you think information is stored in your working memory? And this question may be on your test. And really the answer to that is it really depends, because you can keep sounds active in working memory by repeating them over and over. And it's a process called maintenance rehearsal. That's an important term to learn. It's why you maybe sing the alphabet or other thing, but you've rehearsed. And that's also another factor that we're going to talk about mnemonics here later as well. But you probably use maintenance rehearsal to keep a phone number active in your mind. So it's really maintenance rehearsal too, is just consciously making the decision to learn it, to repeat it over and over again. So the more you hear it, the more likely that you're going to be able to retain that. Without maintenance rehearsal, individual memories rapidly decay or they fade from working memory. So maintenance rehearsal is necessary to keep that memory to be active where you can recall that information. This prevents our minds from more permanently storing useless names, dates, telephone numbers, things that we really don't need to understand. We may have them in our short-term working memory for, of course, that short time, and we may even use some type of process of encoding to remember it. And a lot of this is, you think about the test, whatever you're studying for this quiz, there are a lot of the information you're going to hold for a certain amount of time, but then 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, you're probably not going to be able to recall that. So that's why it's so important whenever you do hear things that are important that you may need to recall at a future date, is practicing that maintenance rehearsal or going back often and reading through it. If this is a career, if you wanted to get into any type of career in psychology and you think these type of things are important, it's necessary to take great notes and then go back through them from time to time. And that will end up turning it to more working, not just working memory, but be able to recall that and even become part of what's called crystallized intelligence, rote rehearsal. And that is the deliberate rehearsing or studying to intentionally code information into that long-term memory. If you're trying to study for that test, it's actually called rote rehearsal, and or rote learning. It's encoding by like simple repetition over and over and over. But then there's another form of rehearsal, maintenance rehearsal, which is called elaborative rehearsal. And with elaborative rehearsal, or elaborative encoding as well, it makes the information that you're trying to memorize more meaningful. And it's a far better way to encode lasting memories. When you encode information for the first time, it's best to elaborate on the meaning of that information, especially by forming links between that information and memories that are already in your long-term memory. So if you meet someone at an event or something and you want to remember information about them or their name, that if you associate them with maybe another memory or experience that you have, maybe it's with someone else that you really respect, then what you do is you connect that memory or that person maybe with someone is famous or someone that you really respect, and it makes it easier when you see that person the next time. It's going to trigger that memory if you use elaborate rehearsal, because it's connecting it with something that is, again, it's more meaningful. So elaborative rehearsal, just an important definition, it's a way to remember information better that involves rehearsing by looking for connections to your existing knowledge. That would be what you want to write down for your definition. So now I want you to just think about and reflect about ways that you can process elaborative rehearsal, or how you can use elaborative rehearsal when studying for classes and exams. Just think about that for a moment and see if it kind of makes sense. So when you are, for instance, when you're thinking about the test for memory or psychology in general, what would it take to make it where you remember more of this information? How would you process? How would you make that rehearsal not just repetitive information where you're the rote rehearsal that we refer to, but elaborative rehearsal where you're going to connect meaning with it? So the way to do that is it's easy. If you want a career as a psychologist or an industrial organizational psychologist, then you already see meaning in understanding this information because this is something that you want to do. So you understand how your studies, how this class is going to positively impact your career and your life. So if this is not something that you care much about, I can tell you that whatever career it is that you want to become one day, or what type of job, or the person you would like to become, I guarantee that psychology does play a huge part in becoming successful in whatever it is that you want to do. So being able to connect the importance of this material with your future, with your dreams, it makes this information more meaningful to you, and you can start to memorize it and learn it because it becomes interesting and you see how it applies to your own life. That's what it means, type of elaborative rehearsal. So now let's get into Unit 3, into long-term memory. Information that is important or meaningful is actually encoded in your long-term memory. And it's a storage system, again, that can hold a great deal of information over an unlimited amount of time, unlimited amount of information forever. Though we're not generally aware of information that's stored in our long-term memory, it contains everything you know about the world, from aardvark to zebra, math to operating your cell phone, facts to fantasy. There appears to be no danger of running out of room because it's generally believed that long-term memory can store nearly limitless amounts of information. In fact, we'll see in this section that the more you know, the easier it becomes to add new information to memory. This is the reverse of what we would expect if long-term memory could actually be complete or filled up. In this section, we're going to take a look at long-term memory and how it works. Types of long-term memory. A curious thing happens to many people who develop amnesia. Amnesiac patients may be unable to remember a telephone number, an address, or a person's name. Yet the same patients can use their memory to learn the solutions to complex puzzles in a normal amount of time. These and other observations have led many psychologists to conclude that long-term memory is comprised of at least two categories. One is implicit memory, and the other is explicit memory. Moreover, there are two types of explicit memory, of course, to make it more complicated: semantic and episodic. Implicit memory includes skill-based learning, conditional responses, and primed responses. Explicit memory can be divided into semantic, and that's fact-based knowledge, or episodic, that's personal experiences associated with specific times and places for memory. Implicit memory refers to the memories that lie outside of awareness. That may sound a bit strange at first. After all, how can you have a memory and not be aware of it? But if you think about your everyday life, you realize there are several examples of memories like this. We're going to discuss three of them here: memory for skills, learning through conditioning, and priming. And just for your test, one thing to know about this slide: learning how to ride a bike and how to drive a car, and even the way you brush your teeth, are all examples of implicit memories. It's one thing to kind of remember the difference between the explicit and implicit memories. That implicit, you may not be aware of it, but it's just something that you've learned and you do, in many cases, subconsciously. Implicit memory refers again to memories that lie outside of awareness. The first type of implicit memory concerns our long-term memories for how to do things that require motor or performance skills, such as like typing, driving, or swinging a golf club. You may sometimes hear the expression muscle memory, But it's worth noting that the information you need to carry out these tasks isn't stored in your muscle, it resides in your long-term memory. A second type of implicit memory is related to classical and instrumental conditioning. Again, once this type of learning has occurred, it's stored in long-term memory, and we draw on those memories automatically without any conscious awareness. And that was the example that I used on the prior slide. A third and final type of implicit memory is actually called priming. In psychology, priming is basically a technique in which it's an introduction of a stimulus. It would influence how people respond to a subsequent stimulus. And priming works by activating an association or representation in memory just before another stimulus or task is introduced. So priming, it only happens when particular associations are activated before you do something. For example, if you show a person, a string of words, and one of those words is doctor, the person you're testing is going to be a lot faster to recognize the word nurse than if you show that person a different word. Why? Because the words are so closely associated and our brain connects them faster. And there's a difference between, there's positive priming, which means if it's positive that it speeds up the processing speed of that connection, where negative priming is something completely different. And that's done to intentionally, in many cases, slow down the processing feed to disconnect these associations and memories and how it's processed. Don't want to get too far down in the weeds in that one, but I can just tell you one thing on that positive priming. It's something that you can use by realizing that if you watch the videos, for instance, ahead of time, those little short 5-minute introduction videos that I show you at the beginning of this class, before we get into every lesson, that's priming you to give you a summary, of the entire day's discussion. So it kind of primes your brain and prepares your brain to already become familiar with that information and materials, and that would help you become better able to pay attention during the actual lesson, or at least that's the philosophy. So explicit memory. One thing to know just quickly about explicit memory for, the test is the best description of explicit memory is stored information that is consciously retrieved. Explicit memory is consciously retrieved. So explicit memory stores information from your personal life as well as specific factual information like the names, faces, words, dates, and ideas that you have. Explicit memory can be further divided into semantic memory and episodic memory. Semantic memory is really much of our basic factual knowledge about the world, is almost totally immune to forgetting. The names, objects, the days of the week or months of the year, simple math skills, the seasons, words and language, and other general facts are all very lasting. They last a lifetime. Such impersonal knowledge makes up our semantic memory, which serves as a mental dictionary or encyclopedia of basic knowledge. So again, semantic memory can be described as part of our declarative memory that records impersonal knowledge about the world. That's the way you want to know that and memorize that definition. Semantic memory typically has no connection to times or places. It would be rare, for instance, to remember when and where you first learned the names of the seasons. But you do know it. You just don't remember how you know the names of the seasons. Episodic memory is different. And, for the testing, contrast episodic memory, it stores autobiographical, a record of personal experiences. So think of it this way. It stores life events or episodes, day after day, year after year. So, you think about your 7th birthday, your first date, what you did yesterday. All of those memories are episodic memories about what, where, and when of our lives. More than simply storing information, they allow us to mentally travel back in time and re-experience those events. For example, remembering the name of a person you met last year at a concert is considered as an episodic memory because you can think about that concert, you can think about where you met them, and that's how you remember maybe that person's name. Are these episodic memories as lasting as semantic memories? Either type of memory can last forever. However, unless episodic memories are important to you, there very easily forgotten. In fact, it's forgetting an episodic information that actually results in the formation of semantic memories. When you forget and you don't connect the episode or that memory to an event, that no longer is an episodic memory. That's a semantic memory because it has no connection, personal connection to that event. For example, at first you likely did remember when and where you were when you learned the names of the seasons. But over time you forgot the episodic details, but you will likely remember the names of the seasons as a semantic memory for the rest of your life. That's just how to kind of remember that. Consolidation. The brain also plays an important role in solidifying information to create memories in the first place. The process is referred to as consolidation. While there are many parts of the brain that are responsible for memory, the hippocampus, we talked about this before, is particularly important in consolidation of those memories. That hippocampus, it's a part of our limbic system. It acts as a switching station between working and long-term memory. And what it does, in part, it grows, by growing new neurons and making new connections within the brain. And that's how these memories are formed, and that's how the memories can actually be turned into these lasting, memories. Why long-term memory matters and why you can't just Google everything. It's not uncommon to hear people talk about the fact that we've entered a time when it's no longer necessary to work at encoding information into long-term information. Matter of fact, I remember reading about Einstein that there were real basic common things that he was very well unaware of and that most people thought he should be when people considered, is he really a genius if he doesn't know these basic things that most people understand? Matter of fact, some people said, and I'm not sure if it's true, that Einstein not only was a poor student when he was young, he couldn't tie a shoe when he was older. And he used to say that why in the world would I waste brain space understanding these very minor things when I need to focus on these more complex things? Anything I can look into a book and pick up and find out how to do something, I'm not going to store, process, and code that in my brain for this long-term storage. And that's, what all of this is about. There are two reasons why you don't want to rely on Google or notes. That you really need to understand and commit to how you can convert memories into long-term memory. And the first is obvious. In many situations, looking things up on the internet or whatever is slow. It's not going to happen immediately. And also in normal conversations, you need to understand some of this information or have a intellectual conversation with a coworker, a partner, or whomever. Think about, if someone was a lifeguard and they needed to administer CPR, what if they had someone had a heart attack, stop breathing? Do you think that they're going to go and look at look up Google or look up a YouTube video on how to resuscitate that person? No. So there are a lot of other, of course, that's an extreme kind of example, but the mundane everyday tasks are made up of a lot of efficient, you can become very inefficient if you can't recall the information that's stored in your long-term memory. So it's important to really understand this process and try to take the very important things and intentionally store them in the proper place where you can recall that for, in a later date. Of course, the other reason is for tests, whether it's a test for school, a test for work, when someone does want to measure certain types of intelligence that we'll talk about in the future, it's important to be able to recall this information, to be able to also compute simple math problems very quickly, or being able to rationalize or look at a test and be able to tell if you don't know the answer, at least be able to identify which answers are not correct and mark those out as being a potential option for the correct answer and make a better educated guess. So it's really, about the measurement of intelligence, which is going to affect a lot of things in your life. That's from what job, you get, what college you get into, whether, you're, looking to move to a different college, and how you're going to do in life. So it's important to understand the impact of being able to store and retain information for a longer period of time. Unit 4, remembering and forgetting. We don't expect information and sensory and working memories to remain with us forever or for even for long. They fade away and they're displaced by incoming or new information. But when we want to retain information in long-term memory so we can remember it later, two processes are important. Of course, we've talked about it: encoding and retrieval. We're going to get into that in a little bit more detail and look at what is the process, or how does the process of encoding, how does it help us convert a short-term memory into a long-term memory. Important definition to kind of remember: the process of encoding is best described as transferring information for retention in memory. The process of encoding is best described as transforming information for retention in memory. Information in working memory is moved into the more permanent storage of long-term memory through the process called encoding. Given that encoding is key to creating durable memories, it's worth learning more about it, about the things that do and do not influence encoding. So the factors that improve encoding, you see some of those on the screen. We're going to consider two factors that seem to enhance encoding, and that's emotion and deep processing. So if you look on the left-hand side of the screen, emotion, research suggests that there's a positive correlation, meaning that the more there is of that, the more there is on memory or encoding. A positive correlation between intensity of the emotion experienced during an event and the people's ability to remember the event. That's why these very vivid memories we may have that are not really positive, and a lot of them are negative, these are traumatic events, actually we do remember in detail for many, many years. And that is a one thing that we have to understand. These negative traumatic memories are the most clear, but also some of the great memories as well. You know, the first kiss on a date, or the first time you had to speak in front of a large audience and you were scared, or in front of a class. You know, those are the type of memories when we can connect that emotion or how we felt, it's more likely that we're going to remember that for, many years down the road. But what about the events that are very, very stressful? Are they easier to remember? Now, this is when it's crazy, traumatic, negative. And most people can still remember when they had these things happen, but it becomes too stressful and they haunt you for years. These extremely traumatic experiences, like, of course, we think of PTSD or military combat, or it could be abuse or maltreatment when you were a child. It can produce so much in the overload in our limbic system, that activation, that those memories are really referred to as flashbacks. They can leave you emotionally handicapped. And so we'll learn more about post-traumatic stress disorder later. But when we talk about memories, a lot of these memories can be blocked from our memory. That we can create these defense mechanisms or things that we trick ourselves to think that these things weren't real or didn't happen. So more on that later. But also on the right-hand side, you see deep processing. It's a second factor that improves encoding, is when you're thinking deeply about the to be remembered information. And there's a classic experiment, Hayden-Jenkins in 1973, you probably read about in the book. It asked participants to read a list of words that were presented one at a time. One group was told to read the words and determine whether or not each one contained either the letter A or Q. The second group was asked to rate the pleasantness of each word on a scale. Though they had not been informed about it at the beginning, participants were then given a test to determine how many words they can recall. Which group do you think performed better on the memory test? Well, the results were very clear, and it's probably easy for you to answer that question. On average, participants in the group that rated the pleasantness, that feeling of the memory of each word, had a much higher score than those who were searching for the letters A and Q. So in explaining their findings, a researcher, this is huge for you to understand how this works in your memory, that the researchers indicated that improved performance on the pleasantness group was due to the fact that their task forced them to process the words in a deep rather than a shallow manner. Think about this. Put that in another way. In order to decide whether something is pleasant or not, you need to think about the object and its meaning. And to do so, you have to consider the connection to it in your memory network. think about that. If it was just shallow processing, if you just remember the A or Q or the letter, you're not going to remember it. There's no emotion that's tied to it. So this is very deep and very meaningful. It means that when you're studying for these tests, when you're looking at information, instead of just reading a definition or listening to a definition and understanding, in a superficial way what that definition is or what the answer to the definition is, you may even recall it for the test and get it right, but the chances are you're not going to retain that information later. You have to find a way to connect it to an emotion. And when you can do that, when you can understand it in that type of way, you are going to easily retain and recall that information when it comes time and when you need it the most. So connect those ideas in that text, in my message that I'm talking about here, connect it to an emotion, and you will be able to retain it. And, psychologists refer to the process as elaborative rehearsal. It's what we talked about earlier, or elaborative encoding. Elaborative encoding, again, offers the important way to gain meaning by linking new information currently in working memory to knowledge already stored in your long-term memory. So that could be your goals, your dreams, whatever the case may be. Connect it to that emotion, convert it to that working memory, that short-term working memory into long-term memory. And that is the process of encoding it. And of course, remembering that data. Just again, it's important to remember that elaborative rehearsal is a way of transferring information from short-term memory into long-term memory by making that information more meaningful. So there are some factors that do not improve encoding. And we won't go over this too much, but just know that, in this example, these are some pictures of pennies. So you look at the pennies, and only one of those pennies actually is exactly a correct version of a penny. And you can't cheat, can't look at it, for a penny, but just based on memory, you look at these pictures and think which one is correct. And the answer is, of course, penny A. Penny G and J are actually common for people to say that it's either G or J, and it's not. It's actually penny A. Fewer, believe it or not, than 50% of college students identify the correct even Apple logo from a choice of 8 possibilities, something we see all the time, not just pennies, but when they see the logo of Apple, they, about 50% with only 8 choices, cannot identify that logo. So what's going on if you can't really understand that penny or an Apple logo? What's going on? Why is it that so few people can actually, even when they see these things on a daily basis sometimes, how can they forget these very common things? And really, what they're trying to point out here is just the repetition or repeated exposure to something is not enough. Even thousands of repetitions, we see the logo all the time. We may know it's an apple, but without seeing a picture of it, could you draw the logo? And that's where most people that were asked that question, college students, could not draw the Apple logo exactly how it is with the bite out of it, whatever. And I know that logo's gone through a few changes, but they couldn't do it. So it's just, the main point is repeated exposure alone is not enough to code that information properly. Which of the following would best help you remember study material? So look from the options. Of course, it would be elaborative encoding. Hopefully that's I've said it enough for you to understand why that is and connecting those things. We'll go over the rest of these things kind of quickly, just measuring our ability to retrieve information. There's one thing that you've heard of, tip of tongue, that, when someone says, hey, I know that it's on the tip of my tongue. I know with me, whenever I'm trying to remember something, a name, I'll start processing the alphabet, A, B, C, D, until I can find that one letter. And it's like, yes. And it's weird how your brain works. You may do this, and all of a sudden you hit the R and you remember the person's name is Robert. It just works that way. So that tip of the tongue test is actually, it's could even be a test question. It's known as the inability to locate or access a stored memory. It's there, the memory is there, but you can't access it. That's called tip of tongue. Go figure. Oh, another one too, I almost forgot. There is something you know of deja vu when you feel like you've been experienced something before, you've already experienced a situation or been to another place. And really, what that is, if you're asked a question on that for memory, that's whenever you have a partial memory of something and not the complete memory. So you may have a memory of something very similar. It may not have been that exact location, or you may think you've met someone. It may be someone that reminds you of that person. That's a partial memory in most cases that you're remembering, and you're not recalling that experience or that memory in a correct way. So it's an error in your memory because it wasn't a complete memory. Because memory is not an all or nothing event, it can be measured in several different ways. Three common used methods for measuring memory are recall, recognition, and relearning. And here's just a quick thing just to understand the difference between the three. Recall, if you can think, what is the name of your favorite song? Who won the last Super Bowl? Who wrote Romeo and Juliet? If you can answer those questions, you're using recall, and it's a direct retrieval of facts of information with minimum of retrieval cues. And tests on recall often require verbatim, like word for word memory. Like if you study a poem or you can recite it without looking at it, you're recalling it. In order, the order in which information is memorized also has an interesting effect on recall. To experience it, you can try to recall a list and then reading it, from the beginning to the end. And most people are going to find that the middle of the list is hardest. They'll remember the first few and the last, but the middle is actually the hardest. And so another thing that really comes into play when they talk about serial position for effect, what's memorized when it's a long list, and it's the serial or the order in which those items are presented that are going to be recalled. So the earlier or later, but the middle is when it does become a little less clear. So recognition, if you just a test, try to write down everything you can remember from the class that the last week's test, or the last class you took. You may find that you really have not learned as much as you thought you've learned. So that is one way to test yourself or measure your memory, is just to ask yourself these, to constantly learn or recognize the material that we've already gone over. So it's just about recognition is easier when we talk about, for most people, with pictures and photographs, things like that. And when memory is associated, through recognition, results are usually superior than what we would see with just recall. So recognition, when we're, not just asking for the that data, but we're recognizing it with pictures and stuff like that, that's when it's a little bit it's a lot more solid. And of course there's relearning, and relearning is something that it's your past experience, your past knowledge, but you relearn it again in the future, and that actually is one of the stronger ways to measure sensory impressions and also that learning, the way that you learn. Forgetting. Why do we forget memories? Most forgetting actually happens very quickly before memories have actually been consolidated or transitioned to that long-term memory. That is, just something to understand, that you can even memorize things for the test, and then for some reason they're gone because you're forgetting that data. A big reason for that, of course, is various lengths of times go between the time you've learned the information and then you recall it or try to retest yourself. That is a big part of it. So the length of time between the events of learning that information, the longer it is, the less likely you're going to be able to remember that data. And in this curve here, you're looking at it. It's Ebbinghaus curve is what it's called. And it actually just shows that less than 30% of what you learn is actually remembered only 2 days after 2 days have passed. So in 2 days, less than 30% is actually learned. That's scary. And so that's what this chart kind of shows us. And once we convert that to a long-term memory and we rehearse it and attach that emotion to things, then we can recall it, but only when that happens. But you're seeing from this chart that short-term memory, if it's not encoded properly, will not be converted to long-term memory and will be forgotten very soon. why does forgetfulness happen? And you can just kind of read that on your own. I'm not going to get into it too much, but there are, of course, different types of brain functions, amnesia you've heard about, that you can read about, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, things like that, which make it, these are things that are medical and that happen. But, if you'd like to learn more, I would suggest reading that. K theory and law of disuse. Active versus passive forgetting. We know about active and passive learning, but what about active versus passive forgetting? One view of forgetting is decay theory. It holds that memory traces, that's changes in neurons or brain activity, passively decay or weaken over time, making them more difficult to retrieve. Earlier when you read the chapter, you saw that decay is a factor in the early stages of Atkinson-Shiffrin model of memory. So you may have read about that. We didn't talk about it, but you may have read about that. And one thing that you need to remember is, we learned that all types of memories, of all the different types of memory we talk about, sensory memory has the briefest lifespan. Sensory memory, that's very, very quick, within seconds. But early researchers suggest that type of passive decay is also relevant to our long-term memory. And some of the classic writing, when we look at some researchers, Edward Thorndike, I think they mentioned it in chapter 6, described the law of disuse, the idea that over time, memories and long-term memory that were not often used, that is, they're not retrieved or recalled, would eventually decay and be forgotten. We know that disuse it's important in our ability to retrieve information. Through the concept, that Thorndike concept of passive decay was probably oversimplified. I mean, didn't get into the true complexity of the memory, the thought patterns, and different things that happen. While forgetting can be, kind of a passive process in which, of course, we're going to start to degrade our memory over time. The longer it happens, our memories do kind of fade. But there's some new research that's really shedding light on the fact that some forgetting is necessary. And it's actually done actively as a means of managing the enormous volume of information we encountered every day. And that's like what I talked about with Einstein, that he intentionally wanted to forget some of the stuff that were memories so it didn't take up a lot of that space. As weird as that, here it's unlimited, but at the same time, he did not want that to be a part of that thought process. Rather than being like, a bug in your memory system, forgetting can actually be an integral part of that system. In the book, they provide a couple of, examples for that. One of those examples they talked about a woman who had like crazy high superior autobiographical memory. And she talked about when she sees different dates on televisions, she automatically goes back to that day and remember where she was, what she was doing. And it went on and on and on. And people thought that it was a tremendous gift. And I've got to say, I can kind of relate to that. I remember numbers, license plates, but I also remember dates. And usually what I do with those dates, I remember catastrophes that may have happened, different dates from Reagan being shot and Mount St. Helens, for instance, around the same time, or looking at these different dates. And I remember where I was. And it can be a good thing, but sometimes it's something that can be a burden and can become part of an OCD that can really go through your head and you're not able to shut it down. And that's what the story was in the book about this woman that had this superior autobiographical memory, that it also kind of tortured or haunted her because she couldn't stop that process of processing these memories, or that recall of memory. And the authors in the book just talk about, when people like that, they have a process or try to actively forget information, intentionally forget it. And it's their way of keeping the flow of information at a level that's actually manageable, to be able to not become so OCD about these things, or thinking, because what happens is you think that you have to remember this, or maybe a bad thing would happen. And it's going through the process of understanding to let go of those memories, because, that's just maybe a false alarm of that fight or flight response that happens to some people. So that's really about the active and Thorndike's law of disuse that you may want to know about. So let's get into the end of this and try to wrap up on Unit 5, the accuracy of long term memory and how it is. And we talk a little bit about false memories. Earlier, and you may have read about the neuroscientist Wilder Penfield, he surmised that memories were passively recorded and stored like a video or and complete with a soundtrack. So the image of our long term memory would suggest that anything you want to recall can simply be retrieved and played on like a DVD player, providing you with a copy of what happened. And of course, now, many years later, psychologists realize how crazy that idea is, and it's far from reality. In fact, the process of encoding and retrieval are active, and we often edit events as they're retrieved and restored repeatedly over time. And that's what our brain does, and a lot of it protecting us. There's also gaps in memory, which are common. They may be filled by prior knowledge each time a memory is retrieved, or we may be replacing it, trying to put together these past events, meaning that, we want to make sense and order of our world, but when we are missing or having gaps in these memories, we try to fill them in. And many times when we do that, we create these false memories. Sometimes that's good, other times it's not good at all. And when you are remembering something, and in the book talks about remembering something that didn't happen. You see that on the screen here, and they had the classic experience. They had these psychologists that conduct this experiment back in the 1970s. It showed that people filmed a car accident, and afterward, one group of participants was asked to estimate how fast the cars were going when they smashed into the other one. And for the other groups, the word bumped, contacted, or hit replaced smashed. So you think about that for a moment. The way that these words were used was the basic part of that experiment. And why do you think that's the case? And so smashed is an emotion. If they just said that they want you to watch this video, and at the end they ask you how fast were the cars going when they bumped into or they hit the other person or made contact with the other car, of course, you can think about what would the difference be in the way that person recalled or retained that information. So they observed, these researchers, that changing the wording in this way had an important impact on their estimates of the speed at which the car was traveling, suggesting that asking these leading questions have an effect, a profound effect on our memory. So attorneys use this all the time. Salespeople use it. A lot of people use this. Your wording does matter because it's going to trigger a memory in a certain way, and understanding how your words impact that, and even how your own thoughts are impacted by certain words is critical. Another thing to understand, it's important that when we talk about false memories, we see this happen a lot, and it's used in identifying an eyewitness event to a crime that may have happened, that the attorneys use these manipulative practices. Either it's intentional, it's not intentional, whatever, but it does happen. And when questions are worded a certain way, that person, who is looking at this lineup, they can be led to believe which person is guilty, and that's one thing that can really cause, of course, a lot of harm. And the memories, whenever you're surprised, you're threatened, you're under stress, or this type of trauma happens, they're highly likely to be distorted and be wrong or false memories. It's just a fact. And that is something that really has to be taken into account when we're talking about someone's life, or accusing someone of committing a crime when maybe they haven't committed a crime. And then to kind of wrap up these false memories, to realize that, believe it or not, there's even been, a record of false memories quite often with sexual abuse when someone was a child. And you think of, where they have accused a family member, a father or whoever, of being an abuser when actually it didn't happen. And you think about, wow, how in the world could that be? And believe it or not, that these leading questions and over and put into a child's mind can make them think that it actually did happen, because they were asked this question over and over, and they mentally visualized it and had this traumatic event, even with this false event that didn't happen. So I'm sure that, of course, that was rare, considering the amount of times it does happen where, the memory makes it look like it didn't happen. However, it's just realize that both of the sides of that can be a false memory. And it's important to understand that false memories can be caused by hypnosis through suggestion, whether it's hypnosis or just active conversation through suggesting or leading questions. But definitely a lot of people that go under hypnosis, and that therapist, that hypnotist is asking certain questions and leading questions, that it has been known through that suggestion that these false memories, actually the person wakes and believe these were actually real, and they actually weren't. And that's very disturbing to think about that. But it is true. It does happen. So explaining inaccuracies in memory, just want you to read about that in the book. We've gone over time, and I want to kind of finish up and go on to the next chapter. But there are different types of memory that I want you to read about in the book, and it looks at different and older memories and two memories that are actually confused, that you'll see that source confusion is one thing that they're going to talk about in the book. But I want you to kind of read that so we can kind of wrap up on some of these slides. Here's more on the cognitive interview and people leading questions, the things that can lead to these false memories, food for thought. But how do you improve your memory? This is more important than, that other section. But keeping with thinking about the mistakes or ideas forming, a memory is like snapping a photo. Like, you may assume that encoding and retrieval should be effortless, but it's not true. You do have to have effort. You have to have conscious awareness. And you have to try to convert these short-term memories into long-term memory. A lot of you may do it naturally and you don't think about it that often because you're already interested in the subject or you're interested in your grades. And for that reason, that's enough to do well on the test. But if you can find a way to make this information interesting and relevant to yourself, that is going to help you improve this memory. Another thing is to use chunking, an organization you see on the screen about chunking, and that's taking bits and pieces of this information. Chunking, it enhances memories based on grouping information together based on its similarity. So let me read that again. Chunking, it enhances memories based on grouping information together based on its similarity. For example, what I do, I'm a huge sports fan. A lot of times if I had these numbers that are next to each other, I will group those into 2 digits, and I will remember maybe a person that was that number. And I'll remember that, so if it's 14, you're going to remember maybe a favorite quarterback, or 7, and so you're remembering those numbers, but you're not necessarily remembering the numbers because that doesn't mean anything to you, the number in it on its own. But if you remember the order of these people, these football players or whatever, standing next to each other, now you're more likely to remember those numbers. Even repeatedly thinking about facts helps link them together in your memory. But remember that maintenance rehearsal alone is not very effective. If you remember the sample before, elaborative rehearsal or elaborative encoding, in which you rehearse by looking for connections to existing knowledge, is the best. So just know that. So that is what you're trying to do. Connect the dots between those emotions, if you remember that, connecting to make them be more meaningful and important. Or creating certain cues that can jog your memory, that is going to give you a heck of a lot better chance of retaining or recalling that information for the future. The space practice, if you read that, it's to keep boredom and fatigue to a minimum. Try alternating short study sessions. Like even with this, you watch one video on one chapter, take a rest, the next day watch another one, or listen to the audio, or, so that is spacing your learning, where you may hear the same thing once or twice, but from a different perspective or in a different way. That's going to help you improve your attention, but also consolidation of that information. So believe it or not, 3 20-minute study sessions is going to be a lot better than just 1 hour of continuous study for most people. So having short study sessions, but make sure not to do, that's why last minute cramming, it never works for long-term memory. It may help on an exam, but that long-term cramming also creates anxiety and other things which are known to really be a mess for your exam results. So preparation is a big key to that. And space practice is essential to long-term learning. Of course, mental images, especially vivid ones, are also going to help you make that memorable. And there's a multimedia principle to just become aware of it. It states that people process words and mental images together better when they do words alone. So if you take that word with an image, that multimedia, the word and the image, you're going to have a better chance of remembering that information. It's going to be, and if you can make these images as vivid as possible or even bizarre, crazy, that's even better, because that vivid image is going to be stored information distinctly, is going to be easier to retrieve in the future. Whole versus part learning. If you have to memorize a speech for fairly short, organized information, it's usually better to practice from start to beginning if it's short. But if it's really long, or if it's complicated information, like you're teaching a course or you have a long presentation that's out, it's better to do part learning, where you're memorizing, or you're really learning the beginning part, and then you talk about it for the to fill in the in between, because you're not going to be able to retain that. Let's say it's a extremely long presentation, but if you can recall, and that's where PowerPoints or slides really help trigger or become cues to remembering that information, to remember to talk about it. So especially when the material's long or it's complex, try to just break it down into chunks of information and learn it in that way. Mnemonics, you know what that is, and that's basically just trying to, to sing a song, or just remembering through what are some of the ones that we learned, as a child. I know Roy G. Biv, The Colors of a Rainbow, red, orange, yellow, green, and blue, indigo, and violet. So, those mnemonics really help to have learning. Realize that mnemonics can help you prepare for tests, but they help in the initial stages of storing information, but they're not going to help you with elaborative learning strategies. Of course, on the slide there, you see the keyword method. Let's say you just have some new vocabulary words to memorize in Spanish. You can use keyword method, in which familiar words or images is used to link to other words or items. Unit 7, your memorable presentations. Multimedia principle, I talked about that earlier. Just understanding how you put pictures with the words is really just a better chance to memorize data and store that data. Speaking to the audience's memory, creating stories, eliminate the distractions, anything that does not support the main idea. You can read about that. Help audience integrate information, just how to connect with your audience. And we're kind of just wrapping up here with this chapter. So next chapter, we'll move on to another topic. Thanks for listening.